Okay, let's get started here. We're going to tag team this one on measurable skills. And Carrie can fill in where I get it wrong, and vice versa. Maybe. So MSG are measurable skills gain. Why measurable skills gain matter? Okay. I didn't see the for you. Okay. So, as we mentioned, we know accountability is very outcome focused, and it's really on the measurable skills gain, showing progress towards some other outcome. Pre-post testing, but other types of things like credential obtaining and other things. And of course, we have many more opportunities to measure these skill gains through the expanded definitions of WIOA. So we need so don't hear future flow. So this is kind of a snapshot of what you saw as the different types of gains. Did I miss that? It
is. And essentially what this has to do with is the programming that is taking place right now to be able to track all the different games is going to be the same in all the so like we have a bunch of meetings where we all discuss it, this is how it's teams, this is how it's here, this is how it's here. This is why we can't do it with the same teams, this is why we can't do it with the same twist. But one of the things that Adam really wanted was that we are always to be referring to things the same way, like in the same order across all the systems. So we won't necessarily refer to things this way, like we won't be either 1B, it's a 5, it's a whatever. But we do want to have some consistent order and kind of how we're referring to things, the order you will see things in teams. What it actually looks like in teams, working to at least at minimum get sign off to everybody. This is unfortunately one of our edits that takes place right now. It's already finished the program. But essentially, it's, for the first one, it's you pick ESL games, type of ESL game for all the others you pick. Okay, it's, a statement of high school diploma football team, and then the last one, those middle two, obviously, as we mentioned previously, aren't applicable yet for Title II, so they won't be in there yet. It'll be a hidden key. So that's what this really has to do with. So as we go through these things, you might be able to say, okay, this type 5, which is yada yada yada. That's just all that really has to do with is we're trying to make things consistency across all the IT systems, since we do have so much collaboration in the agency across the various fields.
Yeah, so I think we will be using that type 5, 3 nomenclature quite a bit because they're kind of clunky to describe. So you'll start hearing that from us, and we'll try to stay consistent. One thing I did want to point out from here, and we'll get more discussion, but type 5 down here, passing technical occupational knowledge-based exam, that is the newest win that we got, like 6 weeks ago, on a trial basis. So in the comments from the Fed back to say how they want to do it, they said, we'll try to type 5 only for IET. So this would be a student enrolled in IET, and then they pass some sort of progress test towards a credential. So maybe they pass an EPA exam as part of their level 1 HVAC certificate, or some sort of exams throughout the process. But they basically said, we'll do this for the state on a trial basis, essentially to see if anybody will use it, because they don't believe people will do this. Of course, we're going to do it big time, and we're going to prove them wrong. But it is on the trial basis. We'll talk more about that. So let's go through these one by one. So the first one is our beloved educational function level gain of pre-post testing. And this is virtually the same as it's always been, except the gain is now counted not only in the domain. That was up on purpose. We advocated like mad for that.
I need you to say that again, because I don't think everybody thought
Yeah.
Say it again.
Oh, the gain is not counted only on the domain of significance.
Kind of do what we're going to do because my experience for the person and they will give us a direct answer on this every time we ask it. We get like those politician answers. The way we report on this particular measure and the way the table's set up, because the days are so different, there's no realistic way that we can report in such a way where we only report a gain and then domain significance. Students will still be leveled by their domain significance when we report. So like if you're, determining which level you fall into, it's still based on that lowest level. But if you get a gain in either level, you will get credit. This is one of those that's not going to be ready until July 1st. So it is in progress though. It's a system. It is being calculated that way on the back end. So you will receive reports that tell you, this is the gain that they got. Is it a domain significance, yes or no? It's the same report that's been getting a bioinformatics report by provider, which says yes or no, is it a domain significance? But now that gain counts regardless of if it's a domain significance. A gain is a gain is a gain. We fought very hard with the Department of Ed on because we know that, like, let's say you're doing an IEP program and the program is very math heavy, but your student, if their domain is reading, well, they're probably not going to make a gain in reading. So making sure that you have a program that's specialized in the training program is very difficult to do it in such a way to where you're having to focus on this gain but teach a whole bunch of this. You wind up in a catch-22 situation. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is I'm still very, and I'm going to stress this very passionately, it's still absolutely critical that you're monitoring the progress of your students across all their games because that's how they're going to be successful. If students can't read, they're not going to be successful. So it's absolutely critical that you're still monitoring their progress, that you're still making sure that their education is well-rounded, and I know you all do that, but I just have to say it, that kind of driving to the management gain is going away, and getting essentially a gain on the pre-post test to get credit for that.
All right, so that's gate 1A. So the next one is the one we've been talking about already. Entry into post-secondary education, or gate 1B. So the participant must enroll in post-secondary after exit, but prior to the end of the program year, June 30th. So they must complete all their services on or before March 31st, essentially. And we'll look at some tables here to show you what we need. Important here, this was something that we, again, advocated about. And I was surprised they gave it, was that developmental ed is considered post-secondary for this measure. In most places, it's not considered post-secondary, so this is very surprising. So this is what this looks like in terms of what you need to be thinking about if you're going to do a class related that would use this measure, or you want to tag students towards this measure. So essentially, the trick is it's got to happen after exit, and then they have to enroll in post-secondary within the program year. So as you get further beyond the year, we call it what I'm calling it the danger zone, because the exit, remember, is 90 days. So if you go past July 1st or June 30th on 90 days, then they're not going to count in the program year. we thought that word in the program here, actually, phrase, because it's kind of perverse to make it do that.
And real quick, I do want to say something about this. You don't have to wait to enroll for that 90 days. You can enroll the next day, but you have to continue to be enrolled through that time period. So that after that 90 days is passed, that enrollment is still in check. And when we're able to see, hopefully tomorrow, I'll be able to share some of the screens on this particular piece of team. This has been one of the more tricky ones. But for that supplemental reporting piece, there essentially has to be a continued follow-up that you're saying, yes, we're still enrolled, yes, we're still enrolled, yada, yada, yada. So that after that 90 days, you can indicate, yes, they're still enrolled. We did confirm on the data match side of the house that it does, match at certain points. So again, are they enrolled or are they still enrolled past that 90-day mark or that 90-day point? That's the check. So you don't have to wait to enroll the students. So that's a really important point, because I don't want people thinking like they have to make students sit around for 90 days. That would be ridiculous for students.
So let's look at some scenarios here. So this is not how you have to do it. This is just an example. So it's a bridge class. The students are attending July to December to enter into the spring semester. Their enrollment is going to occur at spring semester of the second. You know, you can do flex sessions or 8-week sessions sometime, but as you get closer to that danger time, you got to start getting worried. So in this scenario, if they're enrolled in post-secondary and bracket, would that count as a gain for you? I'm looking for answers.
Again, the exit is happening in December. They're done with that bridge class in December, just for clarification on the end.
Right.
So what is count? Yes.
That's right. It would count because they exited in December. There's 90 days, and they've entered post-secondary before July 1st. Here's the next one. Would that be a gain? No. It would not be a gain. This is what worries me, because this might be how you structure a program. Students end in May to enroll the next fall. I mean, that's the standard kind of cycle of going to college. But in a year, that would get you in trouble. So you would, if they were going to exit in May, you would want to get them in the first session of summer, in June, not in September or August, because you would cross that threshold of July 1st. Let's stop and take some questions about that. Because this is a big one, I think we're going to get a lot of utilization of this, especially in our colleges.
From Kennedy. If you physically exit the student team, is it still the 90 days? There's no physical, there's no exit in team. There's no such thing.
There's no exit in team. Can't exit.
There's no such thing. Any functionality you think you're doing in team that exit the student does not exist. Exit happens on the back end. We have to manually calculate. That's the big issue. We have the team doesn't calculate exit. It never has. Whatever you were doing before didn't do that. Despite common misconception, didn't actually do that. We had to, on the back end, figure out how to manually calculate exit because it doesn't exist. So exit is your last day of class, or if you were supposed to have students after they finish class, the last day of that post-test day is the exit day for that student. That's the day of exit. So if you're planning a class, a bridge class, you want to make sure that you end that bridge class with that last day of class, the registration and contact information, all that good stuff, and 90 days prior to when you would need them to enroll in post-secondary before the end of the school year, essentially. Yes.
Okay. There's right there, reason.
Yeah, we have a bridge class that runs throughout May and June, and always ends in June, which would put us in trouble. Right.
But
If we roll them over and get a contact dollar
There you go.
now we're okay.
now, keep in mind, one thing to keep in mind there is a student must get a measurable skill gain every program year.
Okay.
So you gotta do something with them in this year if you're wanting to utilize it that way to then cross them over into the next year.
So if their measurable skill gain for the previous year was getting their GED and related to progress testing from that
Mm-hmm.
class in July, it would be okay.
Yep. So let's walk through the scenarios you're talking about. So the scenarios you're talking about is I'm going to have students in last high school diploma or GED. I'm going to work with those students. They're in a bridge class. They get their high school equivalency before June 30th, so that's gain for this program year. I'm going to carry them over into next year. They're still a participant next year, and then I can get a gain for the next year for entry into the secondary. So they would have a gain in this year, good, a gain in the next year, good, enrollment in those years, all kinds of fun. But yeah, that's the one piece about measurable skill gains, and I have this really stressed in the next presentation. Whereas credentials and employment happen once after a period of participation, like they're calculated for every period of participation, a measurable skill gain still sticks to that archaic program year structure. So if a student, if we're still in the situation, unfortunately, where you enroll a student on June 30th, you're kind of in a pickle. There's really not going to be a way to get a measurable skill gain for this year. And that's something else we fought very, very hard on and got nowhere on.
So, we'll get your question. So the way I see this really getting utilized, colleges, is at the front end where we know colleges all over the place are doing some sort of intensive in July and August to help leapfrog students out of developmental ed or upper level in colleges scramble to figure out how to pay for it, schedule it, get exactly remember to teach it, all of that. Often it's done in computer labs where there's a lab monitor, probably not the best instructional environment. But there, you can provide that intensive class, math class or something, 3 weeks, and boom, those students go into college. They would be enrolled, you know, their exit might be in August. Their 90 days would start when they would be enrolled in June, November, and then you'd get a gain for them to enter into post-secondary. Even if they went into developmental ed. So they went from a level 2 to a level 4. So that, I think, is a disruptive model. I mean, I think you're going to see all kinds of stuff happening around that. Because right now, colleges charge students for that. And who wants to go pay for remediation, right? I was talking to somebody the other day, you know, you've got 100 students, and you're going to charge them $50 for a video class. I bet you about 20 of them will show up and pay, right? So you've lost, 80 of them. So that's where I think offering a no-cost solution concept would be great.
I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to publicly admit my ignorance, and I'll get the answer, otherwise we will make sure we look it up. Does enrolling in continuing education count as a true yes.
I don't think the continuing education is not something widely used across the country, so you might think it is, but it's not. So they don't put guidance out typically for non-credit information. So we would count it.
I think Adam said yes, we will. Yeah.
So it's data match, the coordinating board, that's all that really matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
And
was
grade
the area
school
that
as well.
we would lean on the side and yes on that.
It's kind of essentially the WIA position of post-secondary.
So let's get, I know we got here. Who's first? We'll go with Bradley for it. Hey.
Okay. Hi, Ethan.
Hello.
I wanted to ask a question about if we're still tied to the testing score required number of hours.
Well, only on the pre-post.
So this is our watered down assessment guide, whether or not the Department of Ed would say okay to it. I want to do away with it, but it's in red. It actually says it in the red that we have to adhere to the publisher's minimum guidelines, yada, 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 which is why we still have to put it. I mean, they purposely put that in the red, even though it's not always the most applicable. So, I mean, that's still in existence. It hasn't been done away with at this point. We're going to push the limit with our next assessment guide and push that percentage higher. We found some language that another state used and got it approved. So we're going to say, well, if you approve theirs, you have to approve ours. Yeah.
Other questions?
But there's just to add to that, there's no minimum hours for anything else aside from making sure they're participating essentially. So you still got to miss that 12-hour point. But once you get to that point, you know, you could utilize, if it was applicable, you would utilize one of the other days without any limitations related to, you know, hours, all of that.
Mentioning assessment guide, how long will we be using our current assessment guide for week to week, like next day?
So I brought this up at the end of yesterday. We have, the assessment guide is essentially a compliance document that we have to do with the Department of Ed. We are in the process of watering it down to the bare minimum what we're required to do, because so much of our guidance comes out either in the contract, in the form of AEL letters, or in what's called technical assistance bulletins, which if you worked here yesterday, technical assistance bulletins are essentially kind of like an AEL letter in terms of official guidance, but more on the side of logistics. So, okay, you have to do this. Here's how you might actually do it. Here's what it actually looks like. We've taken a lot of kind of official formal guidance and put it into what's called our administrator side, which is literally in our workforce editing department right now. They have like 70 million of our documents, so we're working to death, and we'll hopefully have that very, very soon. The assessment guide itself is going to take a little bit longer because we need to wait for the final guidance and things like that. So the current assessment guide, I know, basically has language in it that addresses the fact that things are changing under RILA, so some of this might not be applicable, yada, yada, yada. But the big pieces of guidance in there still apply. So like the pre-post test, you know, hours, the requirement to have an exemption or a justification if you don't have all the forms of a free test, all of that still applies until it doesn't apply anymore. But we're working to basically make that document as slim as possible and adhere to the guidance that we've sent out in the forms of the letters and the contracts and things like that.
And we're going to a meeting next week, so hopefully we'll hear. But, you know, it's an assessment guide. Some of these games really aren't assessments in that sense. You know, they're entering into college. So it's not really an assessment of the process. We don't know how many. Question back here. One more. Okay.
One more. Table 4, will it calculate all the measurable skills?
So table 4 is no longer table 4.
Rest in peace.
It's still called table 4 in teams because we've been focusing on getting stuff in teams before getting it out of teams. Table 4, by definition, is called table 4 because that's what we reported under table 4 to the Fed. That table no longer exists. It's now a big long table that has all of the different names in it. We will be, until we can get that kind of stuff programmed in teams, our Division of Operational Insight is working on stuff that we can get out to you. Unfortunately, the actual reports in teams are the last phase of all the changes we need to make. So as of right now, you can consider table 4 your pre, and we will probably change it to EFL, you know, pre-post test days or something like that. We'll rather than call it what it is. It won't have all the other names on it until we program everything. But again, we're doing our darndest to at least have things that we can give you. You may not be able to get really full, but you can at least have access to what's going into the system and what they report.
It's going to be kind of messy year for a while in terms of getting what you really are dying to have on the meetings. It's just a lot of everything. All right, back in the back. Linda.
Okay, back on that. Linda is talking to the chat. People, they have questions.
Good. Welcome, student.
Okay, will keep to be updated so that will keep to be updated so that the latest assessment report will populate with the best class 2.0 test scores. That is in the release that is coming out July 20th, or June 29th, sorry, next week, with the correction for the best plus issue. Okay, Jim has a little fuzzy on the fine points of the game. Can you give me a snapshot of the games again? What counts?
Like this snapshot here.
So we're actually still going through them right now in the presentation. So I think by the end of the presentation it'll be a little bit clearer, and we'll recap all of those games. We're still on the first game right now for EFL games. We haven't gotten to the other ones in this presentation yet. We have one more from Ashley. Is it that they are required to enroll in post-secondary within 90 days of the last time for the count attribute? They have to be enrolled after they have finished adult ed for 90 days. So they don't have to wait 90 days. They can enroll in post-secondary the very next day. But after those 90 days pass, when you're done with them, they have to still be enrolled essentially. Thank you. This is fun.
Okay, just to clarify, with this model of completing a measurable game, you're looking at your last contact hour triggering your 90 days.
Yep.
So our traditional enrollment model of an IEP does not apply because you do not want any further contact with that student that would generate a direct hour after you exit them at that 90 days. And I will say, I don't like necessarily the term new further contact because of the necessity to do follow-up, which we will be talking about tomorrow. But essentially your last service, what is considered a service or eligible service for that participant, which is either class or an assessment, does have to be. So yes, you are correct. For an IEP, this model is no good now. And then get back to Michelle's question earlier, if that student then continues after your IEP and does more post-secondary, then they can essentially get a game after they're done with their IEP. But you need to ensure that either they finish their IEP early enough this year or use one of the other games that works for IEP while that student is in the program. So our traditional IEP co-requisite model, which I'm sure you have scenarios built for, would be more applicable to completion of an industry recognized certificate, like the workforce continuing ed classes that usually result in a DARS certificate.
So yeah, so that would actually be a credential, but you would need to do a number 5, which is the pass one of the tests to get that certificate or credential. And the way number 5 is written, the way it's written really sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anderson, is any test to get that certificate. So if it was even a class assessment, that can still be their primary.
That's very loosely defined, so we're going to probably have to define it for you and very flexibly. Yeah, and we'll give you some examples of different things. Any more questions on this one over here? Yes. Andrew.
Is articulation considered registered as post-secondary? If they do something to continuing ed and we're articulating the options for association? So the continuing ed in and of itself would
be post-secondary, and then with the articulation too. So either or. Good question.
I have another question. Okay. Who is in the denominator for this mission? All participants?
And every single participant is in the denominator for every single measurable skills game, and they essentially get in the numerator for whichever one they get. So every participant, meaning every person, 12 or more hours, is in every single denominator, and then once they get a measurable game, they get a box, essentially, or so your measurable skills game, while it's, let me think of the best way to explain this. So it's essentially you get kind of an aggregate of all the students and all the games, but then we also calculate across each of the games, but it's not a percentage of all the participants with that game. It's a percentage of everybody that got that game and that game. Yeah, that's a little squishy. But so the bottom line is every participant has to get one. Doesn't matter which one. Good question. Kathy.
Carrie, do NCDOs count as entering the theory?
That's a very Texas-specific question, and it's definitely not this guidance.
Great
We
question.
may want to ask that.
Well, yeah, that's a very Texas thing.
I'm making my list. Making my list of stuff to take.
Probably not, because they're non-course based, they're not course. That's why they're called that. You're not entering a course in a secondary institution, non-course based option. But we'll test that one. I'm probably thinking it will not. Here we go.
And since some of our students are not HREC level 1 certificate program, and we're going to take that national exam, will that count on that? When the social science.
So that shows the going back over here, we're getting ahead of ourselves with the sign, because this is going to be this way today. So the type 5 passing, she's saying the EPA is the typical component test for an HVAC certificate. That would be your gain here, and then a credential. So, yeah. So we're getting all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's some of the games count as credentials too. They won't count as credentials until the student academic, the way they're written. Again, the high school equivalency though does require some extra stuff to count as a credential, where something like that would not. But yeah, it's going to be, I don't want to use the term easy because they're not easy at all, but it will be very easy to get games and credentials for your IEP students, much easier than it has been in the past.
So let's do this. Let's write down your questions in the form, and we'll move on to the next one, because like I said, we're going to kind of be cycling through this and come back around.
And then
we will get all your questions.
This is why I knew we would deviate from our data today, or from our agenda today, because we knew there were a lot of questions. I also want to make sure everybody look on, I know they've been passed around, if you haven't been here the last 2 days, we actually have a texting virtual classroom that you can text questions to as well. So you're welcome to text those while you're collecting those and either trying to answer them during questions. I've been responding directly to some of them, or we're adding them to, we have a master Q&A, and we're adding them to that. So please feel free to text your questions as well, or if people just look at me questions, which I appreciate as well.
Okay, so let's move on to game type 2, which is obtaining a high school equivalency. So this one's fun. For the measurable skills game credit, there's no need for the participant to be at ninth grade or higher, or employed or enrolled in post-secondary education when you're at your exit. So you might remember to count the high school equivalency as a credential, they need to meet those elements. They need to be the cohort is ninth grade or above. They pass the test, high school equivalency, and then they either go to work or they go into post-secondary within 1 year. For the credential measure, for the measurable skills gain, high school fluency, they just have to pass. So the passing a high school fluency, again, can count for two different things, two separate things, your credential rate and your measurable skills rate. So that's a big shift. One of the things we advocated in law was counting each individual test of the high school fluency as a measurable skill gain. That's progress towards the credential, right? For some reason, pure logic did not prevail. So we will not let it. So this one for participants that have earned a high school fluency in Texas or process is the same. They'll come in as matches with our nightly match with TEA. But if the individual goes gambling in Louisiana, goes to Shreveport and takes their HISET exam, that can also be counted, but it has to be manually entered by you. So we are losing some of our credits because people are going out of state. And I think that'll happen less now that we have all three tests available in Texas. But still, if I can drive, 40 miles across the border, or I have to drive, 180 miles to Dallas, I'm going to go to Shreveport and I'm going to take a test and not drive to Dallas. That one you could manually enter if the student came back and showed you proof that they had it. Again, there's where the monitoring comes in. If the monitors came and said, okay, you counted like 19 equivalencies that you manually entered, show us the proof that those actually happened, you pull your fancy dancy folder there and you pull out a copy of that equivalent. Question?
I was talking to somebody yesterday about the GED management, how it is much more accurate for GED equivalency than TEA. Do you know if y'all, I don't know if it's just us, but I'm assuming many of us are dealing with looking and it's not matching up with GED as far as the TEA versus you look at it as GED manager and you have 50 GED graduates, whereas with TEA you might have 3.
So I can say two things about that. We can't count anything that TEA doesn't stamp and give to us. That's just how it is in Texas. If you have specific instances, you need to make sure that you're sending them to us because we can't do anything without that example, that proof, and telling our ed folks, look, these matches aren't coming in. Because all I can do is say, hey, people are saying matches aren't coming in, and all I can say is, well, here's a full data count that we've got, has every single person that has a high school program in Texas in it. So we can't work with religious people. We don't have those examples to try and figure out why they're not coming in essentially and what's going on, what might be going on with the coding and things like that. There are a lot of examples of that where because how a high school fluency is currently counted, there's we have instances where folks will report data and that person hasn't been in 6 years. And they're like, oh, they got their high school fluency. Why is it showing up? And it's like, well, they haven't been in the program for 6 years. So that's some of what we get. We also get instances where folks haven't either checked the, all look sometimes and there would be, 600 people in a potential match, things like that. So make sure, I'm sure you're running through all those checks as well. But make sure before you report it, you run through all those checks to make sure it's not something, it's not something that isn't showing up, you haven't clicked the right button or whatever. So that when you do go, again, sometimes I'll get 30 potential matches or 30 matches that people are saying aren't showing up, and I go in and I find them, and that's 6 hours of work to go in and find them and say, yeah, they are here you go. So just make sure, you run all the chats and all that to make sure if they're not showing up, there's not a specific reason. And then beyond that, all we can do is I can give it to our programmers who tell them, why is this coming in and how to investigate it.
Can you tell us, specifics on what we need to make sure that
So you have to make sure that persistent sense. So the question was, what are the things you can do to make sure that they're going to show up? So make sure you've added a record to your applicable school year. So like if a participant got their high school equivalency this year, but you haven't added a record for this year, there's nowhere for that match to go. There's nothing to match to. It's not going to look to last year. You also want to make sure you look for potential matches in previous years, because if you have the last place that you have the record, that's where that potential match is going to go. The way it's programmed right now, it's purely based on the WIA methodology, the WIA methodology, which only gives credit for specific high school equivalency. So what you may be finding is you may have students that have earned a high school equivalency, they don't meet X, Y, and Z, which is why they're not showing up as like a gain or an outcome achieved under WIA. So there is some of that has to be addressed in the programming as we build these measurable skill gains and making sure that it's in everybody and not just those that meet X, Y, Z criteria. But some of the basic things that I find is the individual either isn't a participant or hasn't been a participant for years. They're sitting right there in the potential match. I don't know, probably close to 100 that I've ever manually checked myself. I would say 95% of them I found that way. There's still the oddball that is not showing up for whatever reason. But again, make sure you're sending those in. Team technical assistants or your program specialists, so you can have those starting with dates and send them to our developers and just say, hey, this is showing up, we don't know why.
A couple of other items on this one. So, Spanish high school equivalency will count as a measurable skill gain also. So if you had high-level ESL students that might have a hard time getting a name because they top out or something, but they got a high school equivalency in Spanish, that would be a measurable skill gain. Remember on that one, for the credential rate, we are still working out how to define the 9th grade level for ESL. I mentioned that yesterday. But that's for the credential rate. So again, another avenue, right, to get those skills gains through WIOA.
And just to clarify, a Spanish high school equivalency would count as a medical skill gain, and there's no trick to that one. The piece we're working out obviously is the credential piece, but there's none of that 9th grade requirement for mission skill gain. That's not it.
So type 3 is one that we have not been able to get approval of. This is the secondary or post-secondary, secondary transcript. So that one we're not going to use this time, although the programmers are ready to put it in. We've had a lot of discussion.
Yeah, just to clarify, it will be programmed in. It won't be in your options to select. It'll live in there. It'll just be hidden until the beautiful table we are able to count it. So that all we have to do is fix something in the table where it lives. We'll have it. It'll be great.
And then type 4 is the one that we've really been advocating for, which is satisfactory or better progress toward a employer-defined milestone. Again, kind of vague, but that is the one that is very akin to the work-based 30 model, where the employer says, I want these workers to be able to, pass this test so they can use this CNC lathe or something like that. That would be the milestone, and then you would teach real specific skills, reading, writing, math, to get there. They have not bought that argument yet. This is really for on-the-job training and stuff like this in other WIOA models. And then the last one is the GAIN type 5, which is the one I mentioned about 6 weeks ago. We won a tentative approval pilot. They don't say for how long, like several years, to see if states will use it. This is passing a technical and occupational knowledge-based exam only in IEPs. So this is the one, one of the, probably, I think the prime ones are going to be using in your IEP. It's supplemental records, so you'll put something in a file and you'll attest to that gain being accumulated during the integrated education program. So, those are questions? Somebody, yep.
And just a quick, if Anson, if you could repeat the question, I guess some of the questions aren't being heard by those mics on the webcast, so we just want to make sure they're all being heard.
I can do that.
Okay, so when the student who is the ESL student that has completed an IEP and has not progressed on the test, so is that either or?
Yeah, either one can count. I mean, if you're thinking it's like, are there multiple ways to get a gain for an individual? The answer is yes. So an individual that goes into an IEP, say they start your program, they don't have a high school equivalency, and they're going to go into an IEP. They could get a gain by a post-test, like we've always done. They could get a gain by getting a high school equivalency. They could get a gain by passing the technical or occupational knowledge-based test. So the options are great. It's like making sure you keep up that they're going to get one of those 2 or 3 options. And we have an exercise later on where we'll actually talk through some of these things. But that's the thinking your assessment staff, your teachers, everybody has to start thinking about how is this going to roll out? How are we? Okay. I didn't see this slide in my handout. Okay. Requirements for Game 5 passage may include, so here's the things listed in the regulation. Passage of a component exam in the registered apprenticeship program, employer-required knowledge-based exam. So the employer in the IEP, you'd be working with the employer, and they say, these students need to pass this exam to become employed or to get a raise or to have access to this type of training or use this type of equipment. Satisfactory attainment of an element on an industry or occupational competency-based assessment. So just an element on a broader competency-based assessment. So if you were doing the MSSC assessments for production, there are different tests that you have to pass to achieve that. Passing one of those can count as progress towards gaining that competency-based assessment. And then it says other completion tests necessary to obtain a credential. Well, that's just a ladder to the door. So this is the language that is in the reg or in the guidance, and this is something we'll have to develop either through the assessment guide or through an AEL letter, kind of what some of these things mean. And we're having those discussions right now, but it seems very broad right now. We will keep it broad, believe me, because within this, there's really hundreds, maybe thousands of options. I mean, you could never narrow it down to it. Additional requirements for an IEP. So the Game 5 is only for IEPs.
Okay, this is where we get to play, we'll make the decision. So we're obviously running behind, which I think is awesome because we've got an amazing amount of questions. We can either dive into the next section or we can break half an hour early for lunch and come back half an hour early after lunch. Do you want lunch now?
The question I would have is, how long is the next session?
Oh, it's long.
It is?
Yeah. I mean, we won't be able to get through the whole thing. We can either do half an hour at the next session and break at 12, or break an hour and come back early for lunch. Okay, if you want to break right now, raise your hand. Oh man, you guys are like 50-50. If you want to break at 12, raise your hand. Yeah, I think that now we've done it. All right, so.
That would be the lunch crowd.
We